Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, from wherever you are joining us. We're delighted to host you for the second year to our Mobile Net Zero event. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this event again, as we did last year. So today we're going to take stock of where we are as the mobile industry with our climate ambition. And we're going to review the progress that have been made in the recent years. We've got more companies that are signing up to targets to reduce their emissions and to be net zero by 2050. So we've got more companies who are signing up to carbon emissions reduction targets. More companies are pledging to be net zero by 2050. But the main question that remains is really how we're going to achieve those targets. And there is a lot of unknown yet, a lot of scrutiny from various stakeholders to not just set up commitments, but to really follow through with action. And that's really what we want to discuss today. And we hope that you leave the event with insights from speakers from over the world. So we want to have a truly global event. The challenges that companies face are different depending on where they operate in the world. But we have a great lineup of speakers. I also hope that you will leave with some renewed optimism that we can actually achieve these targets, that it's not just an ambition, and that the industry is already doing a lot in terms of progress. So as we open the event, I would like to invite John Giusti, who is GSMA Chief Regulatory Officer, to give his opening remarks and before we move into the discussion. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Alix. A good day, everyone, and thank you all for joining. I'm really pleased that so many could participate in today's launch as we take, as Alix mentioned, our second annual look at how the mobile industry is doing against its climate targets. You may remember that it was in 2019, in February 2019, that the GSMA Board agreed an ambition on behalf of the entire industry to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest. And since then, the industry has set about turning that ambition into action. And I'm very encouraged that in this year's analysis, that a growing number of operators and suppliers are accelerating our efforts to achieve net zero. Now, given the urgency that we all recognize, it is now key that we see this ambition turn really into tangible action. So today, we're going to take a closer look at just that. And I obviously don't want to steal Stephen's thunder, as he will walk us in more detail through the key findings from the report. But I will say that I feel we've come a long way since the Paris Agreement, as today we have the majority of the global mobile industry by revenue disclosing to the Carbon Disclosure Project. But still much more to do. According to the recent IPCC climate change report, emissions must peak by 2025 if the world is to have a chance of meeting the goals set out in Paris. So far, scientists estimate we have already heated the world by 1.2 degrees Celsius, and the window to prevent temperatures rising to more than 1.5 degrees is rapidly closing. So decisions made this year or in the near term could very well determine whether that target is met or whether the world will face even more severe weather extremes. When we look at the mobile industry over the last 12 months, we have seen a bit of decoupling of data traffic from electricity use and carbon emissions. So while the industry itself has seen double-digit growth in data traffic, the environmental impacts have grown at a much slower pace. So this is a positive sign that it shows the industry is moving in the right direction, yet there are definitely continued efforts that are needed to both prevent emissions rising as well as to rapidly decrease them. So these actions will need to take several forms. The first of these, of course, is improving the energy efficiency of networks. Mobile operators have sizable electricity bills, so efforts to improve efficiency have not only environmental, but also economic benefits to the industry. The potential of 5G means smarter, more dynamic networks, and will also mean retiring older, less energy efficient equipment. Another priority area is increasing the uptake and investment in renewable energy. This will be vital to achieving near-term targets by 2030. We're starting to witness greater use of renewables across the industry, but there are very large challenges facing us. And in some parts of the world, it will require active government support to ensure fair and equitable access to renewable energy markets. Another big area of focus is working with suppliers to create a more sustainable supply chain for the industry. Whether it's through disclosing to the CDP or through joint audits of suppliers or in partnership with other NGOs, the GSMA is seeing more collaboration on this important topic. One of the ways our industry can make progress here is moving towards a more circular model. This will mean less waste, conserving resources, and more refurbishment, reuse, and recycling of products. In February of this year, the GSMA published a strategy paper on the circular economy of network equipment. This was generally well received across the industry, and I think it's starting to provoke follow-up conversation, follow-up projects, and research. Later this year, we will turn our attention to consumer devices and consider recommendations for how to improve the circularity of mobile phones and their components. Now, we are fortunate that we're trying to push forward on the green revolution. At the same time, we are seeing a digital revolution taking real shape, reinforced, of course, by the experience of the industry and government during the pandemic. So these can and should reinforce each other. At COP26, we highlighted how mobile connected technologies can help across other sectors to cut global emissions by 20% by 2030. There are big opportunities if we look at energy, transport, manufacturing, and building sectors, all very energy intensive sectors. We're also very pleased that we've seen the European Union push forward on pioneering work in the space through the European Digital Green Coalition. The better we can measure the positive impacts of technology, the faster we can scale up those that are most useful to reducing climate impacts. And we continue, of course, to be reminded about what's at stake. We see crippling heat waves across India, once again, hugely damaging flooding in Australia, and of course, the list goes on. And keeping people connected can very much be a matter of life or death in these situations. So mobile infrastructure is both at risk from climate change, while at the same time essential for improving resilience and recovery and response for communities affected. It is certainly no surprise to those of you here that there's still much to be done. But we really haven't seen before such a great willingness, that we're seeing more and more willingness to collaborate across the sector to achieve these ambitious goals. I think it's fair to say that the mobile industry remains standing firm in face of the climate emergency. Of course, we can't do this in isolation. So we do repeat our call to governments to align their carbon reduction targets to net zero by 2050 at the latest. And very importantly, as I mentioned, to create suitable energy market frameworks for businesses to accelerate renewable energy at competitive prices. So we all have a unique part to play if we are to meet the challenges of the global climate crisis, and I hope that today's discussion can help us move us a step closer. So thank you so much for joining, and I hand it back.
Thank you so much, John, for joining us and for opening this event. Now, I'm really pleased that our next speaker is from the UN Global Compact. And for those of you who don't know the UN Global Compact, they really work with business leaders to accelerate their ambition around sustainability. And they were one of the early organizations to call on CEOs to actually sign up to science-based targets across the world. Now, Sanda Ojiambo is the Assistant Secretary General of the UN Global Compact. She knows the mobile industry really well because she used to work at Safaricom as well in Kenya.
Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, my name is Sanda Ojiambo, and I'm the Assistant Secretary General and CEO of the United Nations Global Compact. The Global Compact is the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. I'd like to thank the GSMA for inviting me to speak at this timely event and warmly congratulate you on the launch of your second State of the Industry report. Now, according to the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC for short, to have an even 50% chance of avoiding an overshoot of our 1.5 degree climate target, we would need to reach net zero in the early 2050s. This reality is nearly impossible to achieve with the pledges and emissions reduction targets that have currently been put forth by countries and companies. We have no choice but to go into overdrive now and focus on the question that we ask each other today. How can we turn ambition into action? In the past year, we have seen a considerable uptick in self-declared net zero commitments and targets. While this growing interest in supporting a low-carbon economy is positive, we must acknowledge that long-term promises must be backed up by concrete, short-term actions in order to reduce emissions in an effective and credible manner. If we are to build back the public's confidence in corporate commitments and ensure that we are decarbonizing at the pace and scale necessary to align with the 1.5 degree future, businesses will have to be transparent and consistently measure their progress so that they can course correct on their path to net zero. And that is why the Science Based Targets Initiative, of which we are a founding partner, developed the first of its kind net zero standard. It establishes a common definition of net zero and provides companies with the guidance and tools that they need to set science-based targets. The mobile industry, in which I worked for a few years, is incredibly complex and dynamic, and it continues to grow at an unimaginable rate. This need to increase efficiency and capacity is also reflected in the sector's carbon footprint. And while many companies are pushing to decarbonize, they may need to push even more. Today, about 80 telecommunications companies have committed to setting targets with the Science Based Targets Initiative, out of which over 40 have approved targets. For those of you who have not done so already, I call on you to take your decarbonization plans to the next level and set science-based targets so that you can surpass the ambition that has been set by GSMA for next year's report. We need your help to keep 1.5 alive, and we need your help now. Thank you.
Great. A really strong message from the UN Global Compact and a call to action for companies to set targets for those who haven't yet done so. It's a perfect segue as we talk, to move from ambition to action to the next part of the event, where I will invite Stephen Moore, who is the GSMA Head of Climate Action, to take us through the findings of the Mobile Net Zero report. So it's the second year that we published this report to take stock of progress from the mobile industry. And we're keen to hear the key takeaways, findings, and call to action. So Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Alix. It's great to give an update here on the latest findings of the report that we've just launched this morning. So our Mobile Net Zero report for 2022 on the state of the industry on climate action. And if we have a look, firstly, just to recap on the next slide, where we're looking to get to as an industry. And that is to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest, and to align interim climate targets accordingly. So science-based targets to 2030, for example. So what is the journey that we've come on to get to this place? Firstly, we supported members on climate disclosures, and this is something that we continue to do through the CDP, and also with support on aligning to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We agreed a pathway for the industry, not just the mobile industry, but the whole ICT sector, to net zero by 2050, and launched that back in 2020. Since then, we've been working with our members on aligning climate targets to the pathway. That is a 1.5 degree aligned target. And we've reached a really significant milestone with that. So more than 60% of the industry by revenue has aligned their carbon targets to the science-based pathway. Now we're turning our attention from that ambition to convert it into action. And this is the main substance of what we're looking at during both the presentation today and the conversations that we're going to be having as part of the event. Also, a quick recap on the Climate Action Task Force that we set up a couple of years ago. This task force continues to grow, and we had 4 new members join in the last year. So that takes us to 53 members, I think, now in total. And you can see them listed there on the slide. What we're doing with the task force is a number of different things. So we're helping to promote leadership and support it on climate action. We are increasingly looking at advocacy on climate policy, in particular around access to renewable electricity, which is vital to our members. We look to showcase best practice, and there are examples of that in the new report that we've launched today. And we also looked to commission research, so to understand how we're going to tackle some of these climate challenges that we need to overcome if we are to meet science-based targets and net zero targets. Looking ahead at the next slide, it's really actually fantastic to announce that we've got record scores across the industry for climate disclosures last year. So in 2021, there were 60 operators that disclosed to CDP. That represents 66% of global mobile connections and 82% of revenue from the mobile network operators. You can see on the right-hand side that by comparison to the year before, scores have increased significantly. So we've seen a shift from scores D and C up to B and A. And you can see there what that actually shows. So B, it means taking coordinated action on climate issues. So it's a management level score, and A really demonstrates leadership, and we've seen an increase in the number of A scores across the industry. But there is still a significant portion of the industry that doesn't yet report on its carbon emissions. Most of those connections are in Asia and Africa, and they're in countries where we're seeing the number of connections growing. So we will certainly be continuing to work with operators and support them so that we can increase the levels of climate disclosure across the industry, and that will really help us better understand and get a much more precise picture on what the carbon emissions of the industry are. So thinking next on the next slide about what the emissions of the industry are and how they've changed since last year. So the good news on this, actually, you can see on the graph on the left-hand side, if you compare the growth in data traffic with the change in electricity consumption and carbon emissions. So what we can see is that there was, as you might expect, significant growth in data traffic over the last year, up 31% globally. But we've seen that that continues to be decoupled from the growth in electricity use, which was only 5%, and even more so the growth in, or the change in carbon emissions, which is really relatively small at only 2%. I think worth noting that that's still increasing, so not yet going in the direction that we need it to, which is to start to bring it down rapidly. But we hope that we're starting to see a plateauing of carbon emissions so that we can begin to reverse and decline those emissions in line with the science-based targets that we've set for ourselves. On the right-hand side, you can see how the carbon emissions split in terms of scope 1, 2 and 3. Scope 1 is fuel used by operators. In general, it's diesel use for generators. So that's to support providing connectivity where there isn't an electricity grid supply. Scope 2 is by and large electricity use across the industry, and you can see that's quite significant. And then scope 3 is all other emissions, both upstream and downstream. And you can see from the graph that this is actually where the majority of the emissions lie for the industry, and one in which we're taking steps to address and also to measure more accurately as well. On the next slide, we've done a comparison actually to show how using a mobile compares to some other common everyday things that we do. So we've got, for example, eating a beef steak, so eating a steak each week, or one return flight we've chosen here from London to Berlin, driving about 50 kilometers in a car each week, or having half a kilo of potatoes and also some beers. What we wanted to show here is actually the emissions from the use of a mobile phone, including actually an annualized emissions associated with the manufacture of that phone as well is much, much lower than many common everyday activities. I think it's worth bearing in mind considering the amount that we can do with our phones as well. We rely on our phones, so they are, you know, our wallets now, music, TV. We use it to get the news. We use it for shopping, for banking, for healthcare, to help us exercise, to get from A to B, as a diary, etc. So I think it's worth noting that we can do a huge amount with our phones, but the actual carbon impact of them is much less than other activities. Thinking next about something that's very important to us across the industry, and that is managing energy use and energy efficiency. This is something that we've been looking at more closely from the GSMA side over the last year through an energy efficiency benchmarking study. So this was looking to understand what is the proportion of energy use that's consumed in the radio access network, and we found that about 73% of those operators that we studied as part of the study, 73% of the electricity use was in the RAN. We also found that data centers are significant but smaller at 9%, the core of the network around 13%, and operations around 5%. So I think that's useful when considering where to focus efforts around energy efficiency. And we know that operators are involved in a lot of different projects in this space. I've used the example here of AT&T from some of their latest reporting. They actually invested more than $110 million in energy efficiency in 2021. That actually covered more than 4,000 specific energy efficiency and reduction projects, resulting in, quite frankly, huge amount of energy saved of almost 500 million kilowatt hours, which also significant cost saving as well of around $40 million on an annual basis. So I think that shows that operators are very committed to energy efficiency measures, and they've both got environmental benefits but also significant cost saving benefits as well, which is something to consider as we look to move to more energy efficient networks. Sticking on the topic of energy and thinking more on the next slide around where we get energy from. We know to achieve the science-based targets that many operators have committed to, it'll be vital to switch to renewable energy over the next 10 years and beyond. So we looked at what is the proportion of renewable electricity that's being used as a share of overall electricity by mobile network operators. And you can see this has increased from 2020, where it was around 14% of the electricity used, to up to 18% last year. So an increase of 4% year on year, which is significant given the amount of electricity we use across the industry. But I think it's also worth pointing out is not yet at the rate that we need, the rate of increase, in order for us to meet the net zero pathway that we've set for ourselves. So we're looking, I think, for about 60 to 70% renewable electricity use across the industry globally by 2030. And one of the projects that we are involved with at the GSMA is looking at how we can better explain this to policymakers around the world, explain that we would like to commit and invest in new renewable energy generation, and also try and figure out how we can overcome some of the hurdles that we are encountering into accessing renewable electricity. An example of a case study of a particular on-site solution that has been developed. So this is by Claro, who are part of America Mobile Group, They worked with a company called Caban Systems on a complete energy infrastructure solution, which used solar panels, it used batteries, it also used cloud technology for a complete on-site installation to support powering a mobile base station. And Claro have reported annual fuel savings of almost 99% and cost savings of around 63%. So that's really significant there. And it's great to see that we are continuing to see more innovation in switching to renewable energy use, both in on-site solutions and also in entering into PPAs and engaging with governments on this issue. Thinking next about the supply chain and the network equipment that is used across the industry. As John mentioned in his welcome, we published a circular economy strategy paper on network equipment earlier this year, and it looks to address 4 of the challenges that we're seeing in terms of improving the sustainability of network equipment. So one is around reducing waste products, components, and managing better critical raw materials in the supply chain. Secondly is around optimizing the sourcing, reuse, and repurposing of existing network equipment. We also are seeing that we need to better harmonize the methods of evaluating the life cycle impacts of network equipment, so we have a more common understanding and way of comparing across the industry. And finally, thinking about how we can redesign the supply chain so that it's more around circular economy principles. We also announced, as part of the circular economy for network equipment paper with the project group, we worked on a best practice metric which is available for operators to align to. So it's around moving to a more circular economy for network equipment and set a date for it to be responsibly resold, reused, remanufactured, or recycled. So far, we've seen Telefonica and Tele2 have committed to achieve this by 2025 and Smart Communications by 2030. So moving on to the last couple of updates, firstly to flag that we continue to raise the profile of digitization and enablement, particularly around how mobile technologies can help us achieve significant carbon reductions of up to 20% by 2030. We produced some material around this for COP26. The example there on the slide is around what mobile technology could help enable across the energy sector in terms of improving connected solar, connected wind, reducing grid leakage, reducing methane emissions as well. And we are also engaged in a project which has been funded by the European Commission and the European Parliament. It's part of the European Green Digital Coalition, and we have joined forces with the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, European Digital SME Alliance, Digital Europe, and Etno on a project which will create rigorous methodologies to measure the carbon savings of connected digital solutions. So we have looked at this, a number of operators have looked at this, and other companies across the sector, but we want to come up with something that is at the level more of a standard that can be relied upon by all stakeholders, including policymakers, so that they have confidence that when they invest in digital solutions, that they're going to bring about carbon savings. So we're looking forward to the outcome of that project, which will be later this year and into next year. And finally, it's worth mentioning adaptation and resilience, which is really important for us as an industry. And we've seen more operators disclose around TCFD analysis that they've done. So 42% of network operators by revenue and 32% by connections answered the TCFD questions in the CDP questionnaire. And it's about looking at how a changing climate will both have short-term risks for us as a sector, but also longer-term risks as well, and how we can address those and mitigate them. So we've seen some really fantastic and comprehensive climate-related financial analysis included in some of the CDP responses, and I've included examples there of some of the operators. It's not a complete list, but A1, Globe Telecom, Orange, Safaricom, Taiwan Mobile, Telenor, Verizon and Vodafone. And I think just to illustrate actually that we're seeing this in all regions of the world, and this is being taken very seriously, and it's about better understanding the financial impact that climate change will have on us as an industry, but also the opportunities by offering low carbon products and services. So, and I think as, you know, to illustrate how important this is, we've seen mandatory TCFD reporting introduced by the UK government only last month. So we expect to see much more of this happen across the industry, and for this to become much more detailed in the years to come as well. So finally, just to wrap up, on the GSMA.com website, we publish everything that we work on. We want to be completely transparent and make it available to all. So you can find the Mobile Net Zero report that we have launched just this morning, so the latest update. You can also find the strategy paper for circular economy on network equipment that I mentioned we published back in February. And also amongst the other resources on the website, we have our Climate Action Handbook, which is a one-on-one on climate and how it's relevant to us as the mobile sector. Great. Okay, well, thank you very much for tuning in and listening to the update on how we're doing as an industry. Next up, I'm very pleased to welcome Rahul Vatts, who's going to take part in a fireside chat. Rahul is the Chief Regulatory Officer at Bharti Airtel. Thank you so much for joining us today and taking time out. Really wanted to talk to you about Bharti Airtel and your really quite ambitious climate commitments that you've made over the last year. So, you know, you've set a science-based target aligned to 1.5 degrees, and that's going to mean pretty steep cuts in carbon emissions of your own operations and your value chain by 2030. And you've also gone further, committing to net zero by 2050. So, I mean, I think it would be great to get an understanding of why and how you feel you have been able to make these commitments.
Thanks, Stephen. Honestly, I think, is there some echo?
I'll go on mute in case that's affecting things.
Is it better now? Okay. Actually, Stephen, we have gone quite bold than what you told. To give a glimpse, you know, we will actually be halving, you know, putting it half the absolute emission by 2030. You know, if we take a baseline of 2021, so we are going to half it by 2030. And then, of course, we have committed to go net zero by 2050. Right. And the question you asked is why, you know, how are we making these commitments and, you know, what is behind it? So let me start by saying that as a responsible corporate, green energy is on the top of agenda for Airtel. And we take a lot of pride in being ahead of curve when it comes to implementing sustainability initiatives. Airtel is actually completely aligned to the climate sustainability, you know, philosophy. And we are the first, of course, telecom company in India also to adopt the science-based targets. And we are very much en route to decarbonize our network. So what we have done is we have formed a committee from a board of directors. We have got a separate ESG committee, you know, which has been set up, which basically sharpens the focus towards the environmental, social, and governance agenda. So at the board level, there is a complete oversight now, and this empowered committee ensures that ESG always remains a priority for our board. right, to create a long-term value for our stakeholders through sustainable business practices. Our chairman has publicly stated that businesses have the responsibility to sharpen their ESG agendas to contribute to global efforts to combat climate change and ensure inclusive growth. And as Airtel, we have always set high standards of governance and transparency. So we benchmark ourselves against global standards and transparently publish the progress we make against the targets that we have set up.
Thanks, Rahul. Sorry, going to take myself off mute. Yes, I mean, thinking then about the longer term 2050 target that you've set for yourselves. India came to COP26 at the end of last year and announced a net zero target, but it's for 2070. And you've set a much more ambitious target of 2050. So I just wondered how sort of challenging is that? And do you think you're going to be able to achieve these targets given that India's is a lot later?
So most definitely it's a challenge, but let me say that it is both a yes and a no in this question for me. Yes, because we are dependent ultimately on the grid supply extensively, right? And so unless the grid goes green, we will have a certain amount of dependency on that. But the good thing is that the Indian government is not just setting ambitious targets itself, but is also making sure that these get implemented on the ground. And the no, of course, is coming because irrespective of these challenges, we are really pushing hard with our agenda to deploy green renewable sources in our networks, implement energy efficiency measures like PSF, and also the power saving features. And we are also very proactively implementing the clean fuel-based power solutions, specifically for our towers, data centers, and our switching centers and other facility. So technically, we remain aligned to achieve what we have set ourselves to do.
Fantastic, thanks, Rahul. I mean, it does sound like you have a good handle on how you're going to reach these targets, but do you understand how you're going to achieve them in every area and for every part of your business, or are there still some things which you're still figuring out?
Honestly, the work has started in quite earnest. As I mentioned about the ESG committee at the board, which does the oversight. And by the way, this ESG committee includes our managing director and our CEO. So, the responsibility is completely there. So what we have done till now is we have, started a large part of the agenda. At the last meeting, I remember last year, I had mentioned about the progress we are making on some of our plans, and I'm happy to share that we have actually now commissioned captive solar power plants to meet our energy requirements of our core as well as our edge data centers, which are operated across different locations in India. We have committed and we have actually commissioned now 2 captive solar units of 14 megawatts, in northern part of the country. And this, by the way, this whole location has around 220 million people, right? So we are making some earnest beginnings out there. Also, we have commissioned a 21 megawatt solar plant in the western part of the country. So we have already started out. So there will be areas that would need further work to understand the right technology and find the right solutions, since technologies and solutions development are a very dynamic process. And renewable is an area which is really evolving fast. For example, we are also very actively looking right now on certain fuel cell technologies. And honestly, we would look for partnership with GSMA and support from GSMA to find the right partners and solutions, for the mobile telecom industry to be, taking this forward.
Absolutely, I'm sure there's opportunities where we can help you with this. It sounds like you've made some fantastic progress already. One of the things that I mentioned in the overview of the analysis that we've done of the industry is how much of operator emissions are in the supply chain. So I mean, how do you view this challenge as Bharti Airtel? Do you think that there are quite a few common suppliers across the industry? Do you think there are opportunities to collaborate with other operators in terms of working with these common suppliers?
A very valid question, Stephen, and Airtel, we do address this specifically. So we have a commitment towards doing a responsible business, which is led by sustainability principles and environment concern. Now, we have instituted various policies and guidelines to ensure that our supply chain is enhanced with the ability to deliver Airtel's ESG commitments. So our supply chain partners are critical link to our journey to provide, to meet this particular target. Just to highlight, we encourage our suppliers to adhere to international sustainability standards, the ISO 14001, the ISO 45001, and the ISO 27001. Right. So currently, more than 80% of our procurement by value from critical suppliers comes from these having at least one of these certifications. Right. So that's the bare minimum which is there. The company has also formulated and implemented procurement guidelines, and standards have been set for the contractors and suppliers and other providers. This code, which we have laid down, expects that the partners will ensure, environmental protection, energy resource and water conservation, water minimization, improve on employee health and safety. And of course, it is against prohibition of child labor and forced labor. And basically adhering to the basic labor laws. So this is what we have done. Specifically, even in the tower companies, which by the way is our largest energy consumption area, we have tried to reduce emissions by adopting energy efficient technologies and also adopting renewable energy and adopt emission reduction targets. So we, along with our partners, are trying to increase the use of green energy by adopting both solar and lithium ion emission batteries. In fact, some of the subsidy programs which our government is running in India, are actually linked to us rolling out certain amount of green sites, when we start up. So these energy conservation measures have really strengthened our total environmental, output and resulted in not only financial savings, but also helps us in meeting our goals. The other thing I wanted to mention here is the key focus area under the circulatory include the e-waste management and authorized recyclers across the value chain. And of course, minimization of the office waste, generation, reducing the impact from excavation of soil, stones, and gravel during the construction. So construction of the towers, and then overall reducing the footprint, of our data centers through greater focus on the renewable energy. So this is some of the measures, we have tried to address on those.
Great, thank you. And also really interesting to hear about the kind of broader sustainability approach that you're taking, obviously not just focusing on climate issues, but others as well. I think just finally, I wanted to ask, I mean, we've spoken quite a bit about some of the harder sort of technological answers that we're going to have to use across the industry, and you're using at Bharti Airtel. I wanted to ask about some of the other things that need to be put in place within a company, which you've touched on a little bit in terms of, teams, institutions, reporting structures, training, etc. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you're kind of addressing those across Airtel in order to support the climate targets.
Yeah, so I touched, I think, in the earlier part of my discourse today, I mentioned about the ESG Council, which so that we get a board level insight. So that is driven, top down like that. Of course, the CEO and MD is part of that committee, so it gets, a real fast execution as well. The other thing we have done is that every vertical and department within the organization, we have set up a ESG SPOC. So there's one nodal person who's responsible and whose role is to really work with the central ESG team and take the agenda forward, right? So we have that much level of oversight. We also drive this through our industry associations in India, where we participate and engage with the relevant regulators, including the electricity regulator in a lot of cases, government stakeholders on issues of renewable energy, of open access for the telecom industry, and how to make use of these resources very efficiently. As an important stakeholder, we also, of course, engage with you, Stephen, and the GSMA to learn more about global developments. And then we try to internalize and execute this, do a lot of amount of communications within our teams, so that they can become conscious and they are part of the agenda which we are driving, to really achieve this. And of course, we look forward for your support, continuing support and advocacy, particularly on the solar and renewable energies, which we are really wanting to move forward with.
Absolutely. Well, we very much look forward to continuing to work with you. Appreciate your support, particularly on that project, but in other areas as well. And also just joining us here today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy. It sounds like you're extremely busy covering a lot of these different climate areas. So yeah, thank you again so much for joining us, Rahul.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, GSMA. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much, Rahul. Excellent presentation. So it's my pleasure now to move to the panel discussion. So that's the second part of the event. And I'm going to invite all three panelists to come on video, please. So today we have Anindya Bhagirath, who is Associate Program Officer from IRENA. IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency. Gabrielle Ginér, who is Group Head Environmental Sustainability for BT, and Adelene Sinniah, who is Head of Sustainability for Axiata Group. I'm very pleased that you're joining me today. Thank you to the three of you. It's a great pleasure to have you. It's a women panel as well. Very, very good. I'm going to start maybe with Gabrielle and Adelene, so the two operators representative on our panel. And I'd like to start with that journey that, you know, Stephen and Rahul started talking about setting a company target and how you get there and get to where you are today. So maybe Gabrielle, if I start with you, as BT was one of the first company in the world to set a science-based target, which was to be net zero by 2045. And since then, you've even accelerated that target. This year, you've decided to be net zero for BT's operation by 2030 and for the supply chain and customer emission by 2040. So, you know, perhaps starting with how easy or, you know, challenging it has been to get approval, you know, from senior management, from the leadership team at BT to set a target like that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alix. And what I would say is it's gotten a lot easier with time. When I first went to our board in 2016 to talk about setting a science-based target aligned to 1.5 degrees, there wasn't really a model of what this pathway would look like. So we had to work with the Carbon Trust to come up with that model. And of course, nobody else had set a 1.5 degree target at that time. And there wasn't any interest really from our investors or our customers or the general public, and nobody was really talking about it. So that has obviously changed in the past 3 years. The whole kind of mood music has changed. Board members are regularly asked by investors, by customers, you know, they're seeing what's happening with the general public, and I call it the Greta effect. We also have more interest from policymakers, and it's becoming more important to win business. You know, when we talk to customers and we're bidding, we're seeing more questions about our sustainability credentials. So it's completely different, and it's gotten a lot easier to get through, you know, when we accelerated our target. I think a few other things had made it easier for us. Firstly, working with a third party. So it wasn't just Gabrielle having made a model and you know, suggesting this. It was actually an expert in this space that we could say, yes, they're experts. They've done working on this with other companies. Secondly, building on previous successes. So we set our first science-based target in 2008. We met that target 4 years ahead of time. So that gave a confidence that even if we weren't sure exactly what we were going to do, we had been able to do that in the past. And I think thirdly, the money saving. So through energy efficiency, we have been able to save £358 million since 2009 and 10. And finally, let's not forget, I think as Stephen mentioned, you know, the enablement opportunity for companies in our sector. So we are actually helping other companies reach their net zero targets. So we need to have a net zero target. We need to inspire others. And if others are setting those, you know, that means hopefully more sales and more opportunities for us to help with getting to a low carbon society. So because of that, we also announced a new target, an enablement target, which is to help our customers avoid 60 million tons of carbon by 2030.
Great, thanks. Well, Adeline, I'm going to have a very similar question for you because you work at Axiata, which is based in Kuala Lumpur. You operate across Asia. You're one of those companies that have more recently joined, that momentum that Gabrielle was talking about. And last year you've set, a target to decarbonize across your entire value chain and to be net zero as well by 2050. So as an operator who's come more recently on board with this commitment, how did you approach that, again, like that senior leadership, getting that on the agenda of your management at Axiata?
Yeah, I guess for us here, I mean, we've been quite fortunate. Our board is very supportive. And I think we also recently just set up a board sustainability committee. So I think that's on the board level, but I think that's not enough. The other thing that I think this wasn't an overnight journey lah. It started about 2 years ago when, Axiata first started with our campaign. We call it Advancing to Zero. So at that point, the campaign was really about, it starts with me and then it starts with us. So it really started with, on a personal level, what should we be doing for the environment? What are the things that we should be looking out for? And then, the next step now is as an organization, what can we be doing? But I think what's good about the science-based target is that, with the IPCC, with the COP meetings that happen every year, it is an easier conversation to have because it's simply just aligning to science, This report has been put together by scientists all over the world. And, there's no reason for you to not believe it, number one. Number two, it's evident, that, climate change is happening around us every day. So it was an easy conversation to have. Yeah, so that's from me.
Great. Yeah. I mean, you both mentioned the importance of it being on the board agenda, and Rahul before you've also mentioned like the ESG board committee. So definitely something that's has to come from the top as well. But Adelene, like let's stick with you, and obviously you set a target, and then that means automatically transforming the way you do business. It'd be great if you could go, give us some example of what it means, what you have to do to transform the way Axiata operates to meet those targets.
Okay, so we're going to have our AGM on the 26th. And during that AGM, we're going to launch our net carbon roadmap. So I think it's not so easy now to say you want to commit to something. Investors are also asking, what are you doing? How are you going to achieve those targets? So from the time we committed, there was already these questions, from so many, the investor companies was asking us, how are we doing it? So at that point, we decided, we need to start developing a roadmap, at least to put together what are the strategic direction for the organization to move towards to meet this target. So, in preparing that roadmap, what was interesting is that, I guess before anything can be launched, you need to get your house in order. You need to get everyone internally to agree and to also see the benefit of doing this. And I guess what was good about it is that, when we started to speak to people from procurement, people from finance, enterprise, even strategy, people were very supportive of this. And they started to have their own conversations in terms of, what can I be doing to be part of this journey. So I think that was the exciting part. Initially when you start off, it's always about numbers, always about data. You end up talking to the CTO council or the technology department to see, where are we in terms of our data. But I think more important than that is also every department has a role to play. So I mean, just taking a step back, I think one of the main challenge that we had to overcome in order to get the board to agree to, really sign up to this target was to establish what was our baseline data. People need to understand where are we, where are the emissions coming from. So it's like once you start understanding the as is or the current state, the confidence to take on commitments like this become a bit more tangible. And it's the same, when you also have conversation internally, people will understand, okay, now we know network, there's this amount of emissions that's coming from our network. Where is the emissions coming from in different areas, in different countries where we operate? So that will also translate to when we talk about CapEx, where do we want to invest this CapEx? So I guess this is just some part of the journey, and that roadmap was really helpful to spur these conversations. and get everyone thinking.
Yeah, great. So I guess like this, getting all the stakeholders on board and, integration across the company. For you, Gabrielle, at BT, who started the journey, before, that must be something I imagine that's well, established now. So, but what's your, as we talk about transformation, what's the priority then for an operator like BT, who is maybe, ahead a little bit, in the journey? What are your areas of focus at the moment?
Yeah, so where we started was really around renewable electricity. So that's how we were able to reduce our carbon emissions intensity by 80% by 2016. We've now gone to 100% renewable electricity worldwide. So that's obviously something that we need to continue to do. Our second challenge is looking at how we decarbonize our estate. So basically becoming more energy efficient, and also finding low carbon ways of heating our buildings. But thirdly, our biggest challenge by far is converting our fleet to ultra low emission vehicles. So BT has the second largest fleet in the UK. We have 33,000 vehicles. And, at the moment, we don't have the supply of the vehicles that we need. We don't have cost parity. We don't have the national charging infrastructure. So what to do? How do we solve this problem? And I think we looked at what has worked for us in the past on renewables, for example, which is working with others, creating coalitions. So, we've seen with RE100, for example, that has been incredibly successful. So we thought, well, we need to change the market in the UK, because that's where our vehicles are. So we joined forces with the NGO, the Climate Group, and we decided, okay, how can we do this? So we set up a coalition that we call the UK Electric Vehicles Coalition. And that coalition now has over 30 member companies. And, that's the coalition that we are now using to engage with policymakers in the UK and to put pressure on them to say, here you have the UK's biggest fleet operators. This is what we need you to do, or we're not going to be able to get to net zero.
And what about working with others, and you mentioned for example your fleet, but what about then supply chain, because that's something we heard from the presentation from Stephen. That's where most of the emissions for the telcos come from. I know at BT you've set up an award-winning program for suppliers. How did you go about that? What were some of the activities you put in place within that?
Yeah, so just to echo what Stephen said, if we look at BT's end-to-end carbon impact, only 5% is from our own operations, 71% is from upstream supply chain, and 24% from customers using our products and services. So firstly, we looked at how do we use our purchasing power. So we looked at adjudication criteria for all the contracts that we award. So 15% of criteria is now linked to sustainability and human rights. We've been increasing that percentage. It started at 5, then we went to 10, now we're at 15. Let's see if we're actually going to be raising that as well. We try to drive improved performance on sustainability within our suppliers. So in 2013, we launched something called the BT Better Future Supplier Forum, which is actually about capacity building within suppliers on sustainability. So we came up with a benchmarking model. We looked at, where are they on the scale? So we looked at bronze, silver, and gold, and then identify areas where they could improve. And we've worked with them to enhance what they're doing and bring them further on the journey. We also try to encourage innovation. So we run a competition that we call the BT Game Changing Challenge. We invite suppliers to come and pitch their ideas to a panel of BT people on sustainability. And then we pick a winner in that we work with going forward. We've talked about CDP. We've been a member of the CDP supply chain program for over 10 years now. We find that a really good way to understand and monitor and measure suppliers on carbon emissions and climate. And, just by asking suppliers to report, they're starting to think about climate action. More recently, we have actually put in a contract clause in with key suppliers. So if they want a contract with BT, they need to sign up to reduce the carbon emissions over the term of the contract. We also have written out to suppliers saying, are you purchasing renewables? Do you have a science-based target? And suppliers with contract.
That's all right. I'll pick up. Adelene, maybe like just as we wait for Gabrielle to be back, like suppliers on your side. I know you set a target recently, but you see also like picking up from some of the examples that Gabrielle shared. Like, do you see increased uptake from your suppliers to collaborate with you on reducing emissions and setting targets?
Yeah, so this is just the start of our journey. I guess there's still a lot to learn and there's still a lot of gaps. But what we have done is that I think one of the first thing that we need to do is to look at our procurement system. Definitely, we need to enhance the way we promote for more of our customers to get on board. So this is an area that we will be looking into. Still at its infancy stage, but we know it's an important area.
Yeah, perfect, excellent.
Okay,
you're back.
Are you okay?
Final point. So what we've just done is to say, if you have a contract with BT that's worth more than 25 million, you need to have a science-based target, or you need to set one within 6 months.
All right, so very clear commitment and like set targets if you want to work with BT. All right, excellent. I'm sure we'll find ways to come back to that later, but I'm keen that we bring Anindya into the conversation as well. Thank you for joining us, Anindya. You're joining us from IRENA, so you bring a different perspective to the conversation. And I'm really pleased because one of the really critical enabler of operators reaching their transition and their ambition is to be able to switch to renewable energy. So IRENA, you're the International Renewable Energy Agencies. You work with governments across the world to facilitate a more sustainable energy transition. Maybe just like I'd ask you to start by explaining to the people, to the audience, what is it that you do and how you work with those policymakers across the globe?
Yes, thank you, Alix. Thank you, GSMA, for inviting IRENA to be on this lovely panel. So yes, IRENA is the International Renewable Energy Agency. We are an intergovernmental organization that works to support countries in their transition to a sustainable future, and basically serve as a platform for international corporations surrounding renewables. So IRENA promotes the widespread adoption and sustainable use of all forms of renewable energy in the pursuit of sustainable development and SDG 7, energy access, energy security, and low carbon economic growth. So at the moment, we have over 180 member states from around the world with whom IRENA encourages to adopt enabling policies to scale up renewable energy investments. We provide them with practical tools and policy advice to accelerate renewable energy deployment. But we also facilitate knowledge sharing and technology transfer and innovation to provide countries with the best possible renewable energy deployment solutions. In addition to working with governments, obviously, you also have to work with the private sector, and IRENA does this very well through its public-private dialogues. So we facilitate dialogues between the private sector and governments on, very important topics, such as circular economy. This was mentioned earlier by Stephen. And, this is how we kind of support governments on the basis of their unique targets and capacities. So IRENA's Coalition for Action is, it's multi-stakeholder platform that really engages with private sector entities and multi-stakeholder organizations on key topics. So we work with both policymakers, but also the private sector to really form that link and improve, communication and collaboration between the two sectors.
Great. Well, then it's perfect to have you here because we're going to deep dive a little bit more into that public-private collaboration and what's needed from both sides in terms of renewable, because it's an important topic. And Adeline, I want to come back to you because, I mean, you operate in markets across Asia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Bangladesh. What's the situation in those countries, you know, to access renewable, to transition to renewable electricity?
Okay, for us, we're not as fortunate as Europe. Most of our grid, you know, the electricity that we buy from grid, we still have a lot of fossil fuel mix. Even statistically, if we look across the countries where we operate, we are just looking at an average of 25% renewables by 2030, you know, just looking at, you know, country level kind of commitment. So that's what we are seeing. And that's a lot lower than, you know, what we require to meet our net carbon targets. So on our end, it's really about advocating or having those conversations with the policymakers, you know, to tell them that this is what we need, you know, when we sign up, when we commit to something like net zero. And it's also about looking into having more accessibility to credible mechanisms like, you know, PPAs, VPPAs, you know, RECs. Those are still new here. So those are some of the areas of advocacy that we need to do. And the best part about it is it's not just for the telco industry that needs this, it's also across the sector. So what we do is we try to collaborate with other sectors as well and, you know, have this conversation with the policymakers to, you know, tell them this is what we need, you know, and this is where the kind of policy push that we need from their end to help us achieve our goals.
And you mentioned to me before, you know, in previous conversation, for example, that you, for example, I think it's in Malaysia, where you have this cross-sector collaboration, you know, like at CEO level across industries to really send that signal to the policymakers. Do you want to elaborate a bit more around that?
Yeah, happy to talk about it. So we have something here which is called the CEO Action Network. It is made out of 52 companies, you know, which is led by the CEOs itself. It's cross-sectoral, and you know, they look at themselves as a coalition of leaders, and the purpose is really to shape policies as well as to create a favorable ecosystem for businesses and sustainable development in Malaysia. So just for an example, recently last year, they ran a series of 12 roundtables. One of it is for the telco sector. So what happened at that roundtable is that, you know, the 6 telco companies, which you have the CEOs there, we will kind of like discuss what are our challenges and what is the policy support that we require. So based on that, they developed a roundtable report proceedings, which have been shared this year across various government agencies to have that conversation around what is the policy push that we require. So that document is also available online. Again, it cuts across different sector, but we do have one which is also specific for the telco sector. I think it's a very good, you know, it's a good coalition, you know, that I see. It's helpful because it really helps to drive that conversation. And then if let's say, for example, in Malaysia, there are 4 or 5 companies who have signed up to net zero. What we do is we get together, we kind of like define, you know, what is the reduction, what is the amount of reduction that we require and what are the kind of policies that we need to meet those targets. And then we go together and have this conversation with the policymakers. So
yeah. So that's the weight of the collaboration and cross-sector. And I guess that's something that you might be looking to maybe replicate in other countries or extend. And I'm sure it's interesting to other operators, you know, in other parts of the world, maybe to build on this idea.
Yeah.
Great. And India, like, you know, talking about policymakers and, you know, like working with them to accelerate progress, like given you work, you know, you said with different countries, I'm curious, like, are there some countries where you think, you know, they're really getting this right? There is the right enabling environment to accelerate progress. Do you see challenges in other, you know, countries? And how do you approach that? How do you shift, you know, like mindsets?
Thanks, Alix. So there are definitely, some countries where it's a lot easier at the moment to increase renewable capacity. IRENA's recently published data indicates that, global renewable electricity capacity at the end of 2021 was about 3,064 gigawatts, which is approximately a 9.1% growth over the course of 2021. And from this number, Asia has actually accounted for about 60% of the new capacity added. And a huge part of this increase has been in China and in India. Now, it's not a coincidence that both of these countries have also had policy developments in the last year that enable companies to buy renewable energy. PPAs are now available in 17 provinces across China with backing from the central government for the first time. So this has been, a very good step forward. And for India, their government has removed additional surcharges on PPAs in order to make them, more financially attractive, and has also exempted transmission charges to enable interstate deals. So there is progress being seen in Asia in terms of, improved renewable energy capacity, but also the procurement of renewables by companies. Brazil is also among the top 10 countries last year in regard to install capacity. Companies in especially hard to abate sectors like materials and chemicals have announced, a record 1.2 gigawatts of PPAs over the course of 2021. So there's a lot of progress being made. Chile is also another country in Latin America where there's a lot of activity and progress happening at the moment in this field. Having said that, going back to what Adelene said, it's a lot easier in some places than in others, and this really goes down to having the right policy frameworks. And with the right policies, corporate sourcing and renewable energy capacity can be rapidly scaled up. Some examples of this include supporting, governments need to support credible and transparent certification and tracking systems. So this is energy attribute certificates, EACs. They also need to consider energy market structures that allow for direct trade between companies and renewable energy developers. So an example of this is PPAs. So, when IRENA did its study on corporate procurement a few years ago, there were over 70 countries that were allowing for, direct trade between companies and renewable energy developers. So, that this is a great indication of, where we're going. It's also important for governments to work with utilities and electricity suppliers to provide green corporate procurement options. And also, of course, empowering companies to really engage in direct investment for self-generation, which is becoming more and more popular as more and more companies set CSR targets and ambitions. So these are just a couple of things that IRENA really highlights that governments can do in order to, progress with their renewable energy capacity targets and their corporate procurement ambitions.
Great. And talking about maybe like countries or parts of the world where it's been maybe easier, like going back to you, Gabrielle, because you mentioned earlier on the panel that you've reached 100% renewable electricity. So, like what some of the examples that Anindya shared in terms of, I guess that relates with what you've gone through as a company, like what was easy or difficult when you made that transition?
So I think what was easy for us and what made it easier was the board and the senior commitment and everybody's commitment that this is something that we had to do and this is something we need to keep doing. We've set out publicly we had a target of end of 2020 to be purchasing 100% renewables worldwide. So, we just had to go and implement it. I think the challenges, as we've heard, are about, how do we obviously a lot of people here operate in multiple countries, and some countries it's more difficult than others. So in countries where we can't purchase renewables and we can't purchase the credible certificates, we need to look at neighboring markets. So it's quite a big puzzle for a global operator to look at all these countries and what we have to do. And I think also because the market is changing so rapidly, and for example, here in the UK, the rapidly increasing cost of buying certificates, that's just gone through the roof. So you have a financial plan that you think, okay, this is what it's going to cost us. And then when you actually come to it, it's 6 or 7 times more expensive. So that's, of course, a very different business case to take, to the board and for companies to be able to find that extra money, because this is something that we believe in doing. So I think that makes it really challenging.
Yeah, and actually, like talking about the investment that comes from the private sector and the cost. I mean, switching slightly, but staying on that topic. And Anindya, I know, like IRENA, you also published this a report, and I think you're looking to publish a new one soon on corporate sourcing of renewable. So do you look also at that private sector investment? What's needed from their side in terms, to get access to a clean source of energy?
Yes, thanks, Alix. So IRENA, one of IRENA's work streams is indeed corporate sourcing of renewables. We are currently in the process of updating our report, which was launched a few years ago. And what we really found was that while companies have definitely innovated and progressed significantly in procuring renewable electricity, there is a lot of potential in this field. And the companies have not yet reached their full potential, but there is a lot that they can do to sort of get there. A couple of points to highlight include, adopting a target and a renewable energy sourcing strategy based on ambition and types of claims. So setting this renewable energy target obviously provides a clear signal internally as well to shareholders and potential investors of a company's ambition to capture the benefits of renewable electricity sourcing. Most companies sourcing higher shares of renewable electricity, whether in one or several locations, use a mix of procurement options with various capacities to contribute to the energy transition. So really having, a strategy and a target provides a lot of support in regard to this. It's also important to consider renewable energy sourcing options that carry a higher level of additionality. So renewable sourcing choices that lead to additional investment and bring additional renewable capacity to the grid are really very important to accelerate the energy transition. And in addition to that, they also help companies make more credible claims about their own sourcing of renewable energy. So this concept of additionality is really very important. But in addition to that, it's also, crucial that companies report transparently on renewable electricity consumption claims. So, companies can contribute to further raising the profile of corporate sourcing of renewable electricity by improving self-reporting processes and following the available best practices. So there are guidelines that already exist, such as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, but also RE100 has their technical criteria. And, I think as the corporate sourcing landscape evolves and more companies from different sectors, start to source renewable electricity, these guidelines will also adapt and be strengthened, and it'll be easier and more common, let's say, to really be very transparent about renewable electricity consumption. My last point would be that to drive corporate innovation, there really has to be a communication and collaboration between the private and public sectors. By working with governments and utilities and explaining corporate procurement requirements, companies have really influence and must continue to, inform supporting policies and enabling frameworks needed to scale up sourcing of renewables.
Great. Thank you, Anindya. So, I mean, you all touched quite clearly on, like the importance of not only like collaboration within the industry, but also like, with third parties and the cross-sector collaboration, but also with the public sector. So I think definitely and there are various organizations that we heard being referenced during the panel that are good entities to for private sector to collaborate with. We've got literally 5 minutes left. I'd like to bring some of the questions. We won't be able to bring them all, but from the audience. So we'll start with, I've got a question from Giusti, which is about the focus of the discussion has been very much on compliance and some of the other negative drivers as a societal pressure. But are we also looking on the positive drivers for net zero? So, you know, not just managing risk, but also what is the positive drivers and contributions. So maybe, Gabrielle, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. You know, definitely a number of positive drivers for having good credentials in this space. I think I mentioned, you know, about attracting employees. So we are increasingly seeing employees asking about this and retaining them. Around, you know, how investors and policymakers view BT and, you know, the revenue opportunities. So 5.5 billion of BT's revenues, about 25% of our revenues, are actually from services, products and services that help customers avoid carbon emissions. So I think it's definitely a growth opportunity there for us.
Great. And there's a follow-up question, which I find quite interesting, which is touching on the customers. And I guess it's also in the mind of consumers in that in the way the question is framed, that don't necessarily consider carbon as a specific topic for the tech industry, but they do see e-waste being an issue. So should net zero also focus on topics customers consider most relevant? It's probably again a question back to the two operators, so either Axiata or BT. How about this question of, you know, like the expectations from the customers around e-waste? Do you want to elaborate around that?
Maybe I'll just go first. You know,
Yep.
in this part of the world, when it comes to e-waste, I guess it's really about creating awareness and getting the customers to understand the importance of better managing their e-waste. So in terms of the pressure from customers, we don't see much here yet with reference to e-waste. But this is definitely something, you know, across all our operating companies, we are driving that agenda around creating the awareness on the importance of properly managing our e-waste. It's a bit different when it comes to climate, because climate is more of like a kind of investor agenda. You keep getting those questions. You know, what you're doing is you know, you see climate change is happening globally. So, but definitely both are just as important to us.
Right. Yeah, and I guess, you know, you can see e-waste as a subset of the wider climate activities and changes that you're driving in the company. We'll probably have time for maybe one more question. There is a question from Zane Group. Actually, to Axiata, what abatement strategies have been adopted by Axiata to transition to net zero by 2050? And are you planning to use carbon capture technologies?
We don't have that. So one of it that we're looking at is reforestation. We are aware that this should not be used as something to help us to achieve our net zero agenda, but it is also something that we can use towards the end of our commitment period. But we're also in an area where we want to promote forest cover. We want to promote reforestation. So there are work that we do around tree planting, and there's also some plans that we have in terms of, you know, how do we advocate that to also get other corporates to be part of the tree planting, you know, not tree planting, I think it's reforestation goal and agenda. But what is the other thing that we're looking at is also, I think it's always, you always talk about, you know, whatever carbon that we remove or that we sequester needs to be credible. So it's also looking into certification, you know, what are the kind of certification bodies that we should be working for, looking out to work with, to kind of like build that, you know, to understand really what is the indirect benefits of our tree planting, you know, how much of CO2 are we sequestering. So that is something that's in the pipeline. So that's something that we are hoping to drive or champion within this region. So in Axiata, we also have the Axiata Foundation. So this is something that we will do through our foundation arm.
So more through the philanthropic activity. Very final question before, and then we wrap up. It's a question from Jersey Telecom, and I want to bring it because there's a lot of discussion ongoing in the ESG field around reporting. Question to you, Gabrielle, and others actually, if you want to, about TCFD as one of the preferred framework from investors, but then there's also others like GRI. There's other like SASB in the US as well. Like, how do you go about approaching reporting and avoiding duplication of efforts? That's something we hear quite often being brought up as a concern.
So I think for us, we have the same team working on it. So, they will know what they put into one of the questionnaires, and they can reuse that for the next one, really. So I think for us, it's about keeping it in the same team. Great.
Okay. And actually, that's more work is happening in this field, also within GSMA on harmonizing of reporting. Excellent. Well, we're just getting up to the hour, so I want to really thank our panelists for joining us today and our previous speakers. Thank you for the people who joined us to listen in. We encourage you to visit GSMA website if you want to get access to the Mobile Net Zero report that was published this morning. You find the link online here. And we look forward to working with many of you again in the future. And I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you very much.